Hello everyone, back tuning into today's video. We're going to have a look at the weather next 8 to 10 days. In today's video, this will take us up to the middle of April. So I've been talking about the blocking that's setting up across the north, particularly around Greenland, later this week, through the weekend and into next week. Although I've got a big ridge setting up over Greenland, I don't think we're going to get anything particularly cold from it because the orientation of the trough and the ridge, we're going to be under a trough of low pressure. The orientation is going to ensure that the flow remains generally from the south or southwest. We'll be very unsettled though. There's quite a lot of rain to come, I think, over the coming week to 10 days, particularly at the weekend and into next week. We'll start off by having a look at the stratosphere to see what happened and whether this is possibly associated with the blocking that we've got coming up. But before I get on with that, just say about the ads. There's links to articles all over the pages. Have a browse widgets and click through the links if there's any articles that you're interested in. Thanks so much for doing that. There's video ads on most of the pages to be open up in content with Joshua. They'll close back up again. It all helps to pay the gasweathervids.com. So just starting off with the stratospheric temperature at 30 HPA over the North Pole. I've been monitoring this all winter. Been a very interesting winter in terms of what has been happening with the stratospheric temperature. Of course, it's nearly over now, and we're going to see a general warm up over the North Pole in the stratosphere during the next few months as we go into the summer. But what happened through this winter is that early on we had a dramatic plunge in the temperature in the stratosphere, indicated by this black line just here. Got really, really cold through December and into January through the stratosphere over the North Pole at 30 HPA. That's one of the top levels of the atmosphere. And that was associated with the strong polar vortex that we had over the North Pole. So when the stratosphere is cold over the pole, we'll tend to have a strong polar vortex. A strong polar vortex will keep the cold bottled up over the North Pole and generally will enhance the westerlies through the mid-latitude. So that is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why we had such an Atlantic-driven and mild start to winter, particularly remember the record-breaking warmth that we had in December. We got to around the middle of January and we started to get these warming events taking place. Not sudden stratospheric warming events, but significant warming events. Several of them took place through the latter part of January and into February. It wasn't enough to kill off the polar vortex because the polar vortex was so strong this year that it just sort of nibbled at the PV, if you like. But into March, we got this very, very dramatic warming event that took place early on in March, where we actually went off the scale in terms of the temperature at 30 HPA. This was the big one. If this had occurred, say that it occurred at the end of December or in early January, this winter would probably have been very, very different. It occurred in March, and there's always a time lag on this, of course, about 3 or 4 weeks from the warming taking place in the top layer of the atmosphere in the stratosphere and the blocking that then follows it. Now, we are seeing the signs of blocking. Can't guarantee that the blocking we've got coming up over the next week to 10 days is associated with this sudden stratospheric warming event that took place here at the start of March, but it probably is related to it to some degree because it's about right time frame, 3-4 weeks after the sudden stratospheric warming is where you tend to find the blocking getting into place. So we did get that sudden stratospheric warming in the end. It took us into the start of spring before it came off. All of the other warming events that we have through the middle and latter part of the winter, these ones just here, probably soften things up in terms of the atmosphere in the North Pole for that sudden stratospheric warming that occurred in March. So if we hadn't had these minor warmings earlier on in the winter, we probably wouldn't have had the sudden stratospheric warming. But anyway, the sudden stratospheric warming did occur at the start of March, and now we could well be seeing the effects of that in terms of blocking setting up over Greenland. As I always say, just because you've got blocking, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get cold from it, and this is going to be one of those examples of that, I think, that we have coming up over the next week to 10 days. These are the 500 millibar heights for the Northern Hemisphere over the coming week to 10 days. We've got the ECMWF on the top, the GFS is on the bottom, 500 millibars, 80,000 feet, is the area in the atmosphere where high pressure, low pressure being moved around by a jet stream running above. These are the mean flow charts for the next week to 10 days, so this takes us up to the middle of April. We find that the red colours, look at this, they're in place there over Greenland and stretching back into the North Pole. So we've definitely got the blocking there across the pole and down into Greenland. The problem, if you want cold weather, and of course not many people probably do want cold weather in April, but the problem if you would like cold weather in April is that this trough is still being centred generally over and to the west of the country, because we've got this ridge here across central parts of Europe. So even now, things still not quite right to get us into a cold pattern. The jet stream is doing something like that, and it means that despite the blocking that is in place over the pole and across Greenland, the flow is still generally off the Atlantic, still generally from the southwest. If we wanted to tap into a cold pattern, we would need to send this trough here over to central parts of Europe, and then that will combine with the blocking to turn the winds into the north. As it is, it looks like the trough is going to be centred generally to the west and the southwest of the country. That is the ECMWF, the GFS, very similar. There's the blocking well and truly in place across Greenland particularly. There's the deep trough down to the south and west, so it means that despite the blocking, the flow is still generally coming from the westerly or southwesterly direction. It will be very unsettled. That's a really deep trough. It will be throwing up bands of rain from the south and west, but I don't think it's going to be especially cold. These are the GFS temperature and precipitation ensembles for the next 2 weeks. The red line here being the 30-year temperature average. Now, we are going to go a bit below average at the end of this week and into the weekend. Temperatures are nothing to write home about, so you're going to be on the cool side, but not as much as if we was really tapping in to the northerly wind that we could have done with so much blocking over Greenland. As we get into next week, actually, the trend is to warm the temperatures up a little bit. The main thing probably is the rainfall coming up. I was explaining this yesterday, so lots and lots of precipitation spikes there. Remember, dates on the bottom of the chart. Lots of precipitation spikes, particularly going into the weekend and then on into next week. A really wet spell could be getting itself going. Temperature anomalies are going to be a bit below average, so I don't want to sort of give you the idea that we aren't going to get any cool weather. It's going to be a bit cooler than average for the coming week. This is the 5th through to the 13th of April. See generally the blue colours around the UK, as it is for most of Western Europe. So temperatures around a degree or so cooler than you would expect, but we're not locking into a really cold pattern. The precipitation anomaly, that's coming out generally wetter than average, so it's going to be a cool wet week from the 5th through to the 13th of April. Let's just have a very quick look at the generic. And we'll start off with the GFS. So this is the GFS for Saturday. Very indicative of what we're just looking at with the height anomaly. So we've got that deep trough centred right over the top of the country. There it is, with the ridge pulling up through the Atlantic, going up towards Greenland as well. It means that the jet stream is doing something like that. We're almost on the cold side of the jet under this trough of low pressure, but the flow is still generally westerly, albeit if you follow the isobars back, the air is probably originating from Greenland, something like that. So not going to be especially warm by any means, but it is still generally Atlantic-based air. Very unsettled with that trough of low pressure over the country. That continues into Sunday. In fact, could bring another band of quite heavy rain across the country on Sunday. And then we go through into Monday. Look at all this blocking that we've got around Greenland and Iceland. We never see the orange-yellow colours centred around Greenland and Iceland there. That's telling you have a proper area of high pressure. But trough of low pressure is generally centred to the southwest. So again, despite the blocking, the flow is still more or less coming up from the south or the southwest, although it is trying to back easterly for Scotland. So maybe some colder air will be pulled out of Scandinavia in towards Scotland as we get through towards the start of next week. We go into the middle part of next week, still keeping the same setup of high pressure to the north and low pressure to the south. So it is a blocked scenario albeit the flow is still generally coming up from the south or the southwest. It's so close to pulling down some really cold air from the north, but just not quite coming off. We end up on day 10, still in the broad pattern, but maybe beginning to lose the intensity of the blocking up to the north. But it's still the same idea that we've got high pressure to the north, low pressure is to the south. And probably turning a bit drier as well as this ridge starts to push down across the country, and possibly bringing some colder air with it actually out of the north. Remember, the models always try to break down blocking quicker than it normally does break down, so not sure about that chart really on day 10, Friday the 15th of April. Just have a very quick look at the ECMDF. That's very similar. So we've got this ridge up to the north. The trough is over country for the weekend. It can be a really unsettled weekend with showers or longer spells of rain. Start of next week tries to back the winds into the east. That's particularly for Scotland. So we could pull some colder air into Scotland early next week. Otherwise, it's just a lot of wet weather and pretty cool temperatures, but nothing especially cold. We go through to the middle part of next week. Broad pattern is maintained. We've got block there centred firmly around Greenland and going down to the Atlantic. Trough of low pressure is over UK. The flow again generally doing something like that. So still more or less bringing the air up from the south and the southwest. And then it's the second half of next week. The broad pattern is maintained. Signs of that high pressure beginning to move more towards Canada, but still generally under that trough of low pressure with the jet stream very much elongated through the Atlantic, doing something like that. It's a usual jet stream pattern certainly, and almost pulling cold air down in towards Scotland, but for the rest of the country probably still generally on the mild side. Have a look at the upper air temperatures. You see that cold air is just about getting in towards Scotland on Friday the 15th of April, but otherwise the air is still generally Atlantic based, not particularly cold, but quite cool, especially under rain bands and persistent cloud. The temperature will feel pretty dismal, albeit it isn't a tremendously cold air mass. The real cold is just trying to get into Scotland and being kept at bay. So it's certainly a very interesting pattern, this. It probably is related to that sudden stratospheric warming that we had at the start of March, because it's about right when you'd expect to see it around 3-4 weeks after some stratospheric warming, when you tend to get the blocking. But as I always say, the crucial factor is not so much getting blocked, although that is important, it's exactly where the blocking is sitting. And just because you've got blocking, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to get cold and snow from it. This is a classic example of that. If this had been in the middle of winter, it's possible this trough would have been pushed eastwards because the cold would have been stronger, the cold air would have been stronger trying to get down from the north. So maybe if this was winter, it would have been enough to force us into a cold pattern. We'll never know. But that's how it's looking anyway. Certainly very unsettled. I think going to be a lot of rain for the coming week to 10 days. Temperatures are going to be quite cool, but nothing terribly cold showing up at this stage. It needs watching just because of the extent of the blocking over Greenland. It could be enough eventually to give us some cold weather, so it needs to keep an eye on. But cool and wet really sums it up to middle of April. That's all for now. Thanks.